Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a deep dive into some of the CAD because I have done a whole lot of CAD work lately. So let's hop right in. Okay, the first part we are going to be hopping into is just overview of the left console. I've modeled all the little pieces in here. Just for a quick look, I don't have all the text turned on because it doesn't stick to the panel that you're modeling. The sketches basically just float and they stay there, so you don't actually get to read your own text. I've got the gear panel. This is all of our flaps and everything else. And basically, as we come back, this is all completely modeled. I did extend the sides, that way it's a little bit more square, a little bit easier to make, and it gives me a little bit of space for things like actually making a curve. Seems like fun. So that is a high-level overview of just the fact that I completed all the panels, have not done the throttle quadrant. That's going to be an entire nightmare, but let's start deep diving into some of the panels. Alright, quick overview. We've got all the panels with the MDF modeled, so that way we can actually cut it out. This is quite a few pieces. There's the top plate, which is kind of obvious. There's this front plate, which is going to be a little interesting to actually attach. Back plate, inner plate, which isn't really going to go anywhere, and then this one is actually two outside plates. That way I can get into the inner mechanisms and work on them while still keeping a little bit of structure with this guy. The vertical stringers go all the way back. The only one that's different is going to be this guy, just so that I can attach it. These guys, I haven't 100% figured out how I'm going to attach, but I'm probably just going to run M5s or something straight from the top of the panel into this. It is technically wide enough to hold the little threaded inserts that I'm using. They are 0.3 inches wide for hole and probably about 0.5, so they're going to be the perfect size for this. It's going to be a little interesting actually drilling a hole on an angle that matches with those, so we're going to see how we're going to do that. I'm not 100% sure, but we're going to figure out something. So yeah, those are all the MDF panels. Okay, the first one we are going to take a look at is the antenna select panel. This one's really not going to be used a whole lot, but essentially makes it so that you can actually pick an antenna on the top of the jet or on the bottom of the jet. Very useful for when you're doing things like talking to ATC on the ground and you want to use the top antenna because broadcasting into the ground makes for a really bad reception. So that's kind of what this is for. There's also an IFF upper lower and then an ALE39 reset, which I'm assuming is something like a complete hard reset where you can't use it again, so it probably is similar to a Zero Eyes, but I'm completely guessing on that. It's not actually modeled in the sim, but we're definitely putting it in. So this one has ground shared between them all, so 1, 2, 3 switches, no buttons, and power ground, so we're looking at 5 total, which means it should fit on one RJ45. So, on to the next panel. Okay, the next one over is going to be our APU panel. So this has 2 buttons, a whole lot of LEDs, and this is actually going to be a status LED for APU ready or not. And technically the LED pops up, but I'm going to use this as an actual indicator and basically just light up the actual panel the same way that we're lighting up all the text, just with an LED that's isolated from it. So we've got a shared power ground, so that is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for the LEDs. Should fit on one RJ45. So you guys have seen the RJ45 before. I've made a couple of updates, but not too many. I think this was the second one that we really converted over. There are going to be a whole lot of inputs and outputs. Really only need one encoder, one rotary encoder, but a whole lot of potentiometers. Is going to be a little interesting. I am going to have a high and a low fidelity mode, which is essentially going to turn all the potentiometers into a click type, where it's click for incrementals, or it's going to be completely down on the bottom. That way you can map it both ways, because some of the simulator doesn't have an actual axis to map to. So we are going to make it so that we can do both ways of a volume increase click, or a actual just potentiometer set to position. On the next panel. Alright, you guys know the drill. This one is the formation lights. 2 potentiometers. I'm going to have to make sure that they can be potentiometers and not rotary encoders, but on the plus side, those can essentially be swapped out. They use the same size nuts and they fit in the same size holes. The only difference is going to be that the RJ45s potentially could increase, because going from a 5, so they could actually decrease, but going from a 5 to a 3 pin could actually have a significant difference, but I don't think they're going to go that way. They could, but this is essentially this panel. Pretty simple, 3 position, 2 position, and this is actually a rotating knob. It probably has a little bit more indicators on it. There does need to be a little bit of text on some of these guys, but they're pretty darn close. This one is going to have 2 RJ45s and not a huge number of switches, but a good amount. Alright, coming back, we have got the external tanks. This just basically controls where our fuel is coming from, where it's coming from, if we want to dump any, and our fuel extension probe. This should be roughly 2 RJ45s, and yeah, this guy is ready to be made. I'm kind of excited on this one. This one is a super useful panel, and I can put it behind the Thrustmaster Warthog, because some of the other panels actually conflict, but we'll get into it. Okay, the FCS panel has a little bit of color. We actually have a guarded switch. It's the first guarded switch that we've come across. Sorry, it's the second guarded switch, but this one does have some color. And for this FCS reset, I'm going to do the same thing that we're going to do on the other one, and I'm going to buy essentially just a push button. And when I get that, I'm going to model that for the size of the button. Pretty simple. We are going to use a rotary encoder for the rudder trim. That way I can just keep on clicking it. And I can also push in for takeoff trim. It's a very simple way of doing it. Not exactly accurate, but it's a very simple way of doing it. The fire test panel we covered. It's a super simple one. On, off, some lights. Very basic. That's also why I started with the panel. This one we've already actually made. I'm working on some of the electronics. We will get to that one in a future video pretty soon, because a lot of the electronics are ready to actually be wired, run, tested, the works. We're going to get into that. This is going to be kind of the pioneer into the cockpit for the electronics. Alright, this one is the landing gear. Super excited about this. This is going to have basically up, down, a lock override, and a warning silence for the gear annunciator in case you actually don't want the gear, belly up landing, something like that. This guy is going to be so useful. That's the #1 thing that you use. Every takeoff and landing, you're always flipping the gear. The only part that's really left on this one is to actually model the gear handle. I think I'm going to 3D print it and either do a clamshell style where it actually clamps in and we just put some sideways screws, or I'm going to actually fit it by undersizing it, heating it up, and then just sticking it on, and it will conform to the size of it. We'll see which method I go with, but that's pretty much the only piece that's left on this. Realistically, I could leave it even just like this and just flip the switch. This one I'm super excited to put in. Alright, this little guy is the GenT control panel. Essentially, it's to remove the generator from each other. That way they can run independently. So if you have an engine failure, you can flip this, and whichever one's working will continue to generate power. Kind of an important thing because everything in the F-18 runs on electronics, so you're gonna need power. But this one, even simpler than most of them, it does have the guarded switch, so we're gonna essentially hope that there's enough threads to grab onto. If not, I'm gonna have to get very inventive, or unfortunately potentially leave the cap off, or I might just have to recess the top. We'll see what I do, or I could actually mount it how it's supposed to, because there is a hole in the back. Should work well, but we'll see. So we're going to have to make one of these, figure out how it feels, figure out how it looks, and go from there. But that's the GenT control panel. Moving on. Alright, this little guy is the ground power panel. I can't say I've ever actually used it in the simulator. The sketch is a little bit off, but shouldn't be a problem because it's well zeroed on the machine itself. So that shouldn't pose any problems at all, but I do want to fix that at some point. But yeah, this one's a super easy one. 5 little switches, basically for use on the ground, more so for testing than anything else, but if you need external power, you can flip that on. That way you can get all your avionics ready, and you can actually do a couple of pre-startup things before you really start the jet and start burning some fuel on the next panel. Alright, this guy is the hydraulic select panel. Essentially, it's just an override if you need it. That's pretty much it. I think I've used this once just to see what it did. That was about it. So, not a super used panel, but a useful one if you really need it. Probably in the event of something actually failing or getting shot out, but that's way in the system. So, might actually have to figure out when we would ever use that, and yeah. Okay, this one's got a chunk of stuff on it, and this is a nice important one. This is essentially the landing panel, goes right underneath the gear panel. I split them into 2, that way they're easier to mount, easier to work with, etc. But essentially, all of the landing controls, hook bypass, landing light, launch bar, flaps, anti-skid, your emergency brake, and I've got a temporary way that I'm going to do the emergency brake. That's essentially just going to be it's going to be a rotary encoder, that way it allows me to rotate it clockwise or counterclockwise, and then instead of actually a pull handle, I'm going to just use the push functionality, trigger another switch, and instead of push-pull, I actually looked and the mapping is a binary one that you can actually use to push or pull it, so we're going to use that. Should be super useful, kind of excited about that. And then for the safe jettison, it actually does have a rotary and a push. So that is going to be the exact same for a rotary encoder. That'll give us the option of doing a negative or a positive and an actual jettison button. So that one's going to be super useful, super nice to have, just like the gear panel and the parking brake. Hook's probably going to work something like this because it's a twist and pull and push. So hook's probably going to be very similar, or the hook panel with the wing fold. It's going to be very similar. Okay, this little guy is the onboard oxygen system. I did have to kind of take a little bit of creative liberty with this one because it's not in the blueprints I was using, but it is in DCS where it's basically just a binary. It was a bottle fed system, now it's an onboard oxygen generation system. Oxygen flow, binary on off, simple one, but this is going to be kind of tricky to get in because this panel on the bottom is actually the same size as the top one, so we're going to have to finagle that one in there just a bit. We're going to have to leave some corners so that we can actually screw it in, stuff like that. So hopefully this one doesn't pose too much of a problem, but it is modeled. I have figured out how I would like to do it, so we're going to make this work. So hopefully you guys like that kind of quick overview. Hopefully you like the transitions and some of the excitement of seeing all the little things that I've been modeling. There are tens, if not more than into the hundreds of hours worth of work just in modeling these guys. They take at least a couple hours a piece, so maybe not 100, but they're quite a pretty significant investment of time in this guy. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing some of the details of it, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.